Let me show you the moment Washington got it completely wrong. A few months ago, Donald Trump stood in front of the cameras with that same familiar swagger and said Canada should just become the 51st state. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a flat statement, delivered like a fact. Then he went further. "We don't need anything Canada has," he said. Sit with that for a second. We don't need anything Canada has. This was the leader of the world's biggest economy, commander of its most powerful military, and probably the loudest voice in global politics, looking at America's closest neighbor, its largest trading partner, a country sharing almost 9,000 kilometers of border with the US, and deciding public humiliation was somehow the smart play. That was the opening move, and the world sat back to watch how Canada would respond. Would Ottawa fold? Would Prime Minister Mark Carney fly down to Washington ready to cut a deal from a position of weakness? Would Canada accept the old logic that the smaller country always caves to the bigger one? That's clearly what Washington was betting on. It's not what happened. My name is Evelyn Carter. I studied political science at the University of Toronto, and for years I've focused on how power actually moves in international politics. Not the version staged for cameras, but the one buried in supply chains, energy contracts, trade flows, and the quiet decisions finance ministers make long before any president steps up to a microphone. What I'm about to walk you through isn't a feel-good underdog story about Canada beating the United States. It's something sharper than that. It's a case study in what happens when a powerful leader badly misjudges his own vulnerabilities, and what happens next once the bill comes due. Because this was never really about tariffs or hurt feelings between allies. At its core, this was about leverage, dependence, and the blunt math of a supply chain Washington had spent decades pretending it could ignore. And the story doesn't end with Canada backing down. It ends somewhere far more interesting, with the most powerful political figure on Earth quietly, reluctantly, unmistakably changing course. So let's go back to where this started. From day one, the Trump administration's approach to Canada wasn't strategy, it was theater. And the script was familiar. Pick a target, crank the rhetoric up to maximum, assume they'll fold because America is bigger and louder, then declare victory. The flaw in that plan, the expensive, glaring flaw, was the assumption that Canada had nowhere else to turn. That assumption turned out to be wrong in almost every way possible. And at the time, Washington either didn't see it or refused to. So the pressure kept climbing. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer lumped Canada in with China during talk of retaliatory tariffs. Pause on that. Canada, America's largest trading partner, filed under the same heading as China, the same Canada supplying nearly all of America's imported natural gas, 99%. Hold on to that number, we're coming back to it. Around the same time, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick went after Canada's decision to pull American wine off store shelves, calling it an insult to America. That phrase says everything about the mood at the time. Instead of a clear-eyed look at supply chains that took generations to build, the conversation turned into something closer to wounded pride wearing a policy costume. And here's where I want to be precise. I don't think Donald Trump lacks intelligence. My concern is something else entirely. I think he spent years surrounded by people paid to agree with him. He built his career in rooms where power worked as a blunt object, and because of that, he rarely had to face an opponent who simply refused to be intimidated. Canada refused that role, and that refusal changed everything. Here's what most American coverage missed while it was happening. While Washington was busy performing strength, Ottawa was quietly building leverage. No dramatic speeches, no viral moments, just patient, methodical work. The kind that comes from a country that doesn't need to prove its position because it already understands it. The first real signal didn't come from Parliament. It came from grocery stores. In Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, and towns across the country, ordinary Canadians started making individual choices that added up to something impossible to ignore. No government mandate, no coordinated campaign, just people quietly deciding to stop buying American. The Buy Canadian movement took off fast. Facebook groups built around Canadian-made products swelled past 1.4 million members. Barcode scanning apps that flagged American products became genuinely popular. Wine, spirits, entire categories of U.S. brands. Canadians turned away from them, quietly and consistently. Then the numbers started talking. American wine exports to Canada didn't dip, they collapsed, down 78% from roughly $460 million to just $13 million. That's $357 million gone from a single market, and almost none of it forced by government policy, just people choosing differently. Zoom out further, and it gets even more brutal. Canada alone accounted for 81% of every dollar the U.S. lost in wine exports worldwide. More than 4 out of every $5 America lost globally came from one country simply shopping elsewhere. It didn't stop at wine. American liquor exports to Canada dropped 85% in the second quarter of 2025. What remained was worth less than $10 million. Brown-Forman, the company behind Jack Daniel's, reported a 62% drop in Canadian sales. Kentucky whiskey exports to Canada were cut in half, hitting a 10-year low. Then came the announcement that made the trend impossible to wave away. Jim Beam confirmed its Claremont, Kentucky distillery would suspend production through all of 2026. A major American bourbon plant going quiet because Canadians stopped buying bourbon. That's not a statistic on a slide. That's missed shifts, strained small businesses, and communities absorbing the fallout. Eventually, that fallout reached members of Congress whose districts depend on those industries. Meanwhile, Canadian public opinion never wavered. Polling showed 73% of Canadians wanted the boycott to continue, with only 20% ready to bring American products back. That's not a policy a phone call can undo. That's a national mood. And once attitudes like that set in, they don't move easily. Before long, Washington started feeling it politically. Wine industry lobbyists showed up in congressional offices. Senators from California, New York, and Kentucky started asking uncomfortable questions about the administration's trade strategy. Quietly, a different question started making the rounds. Was any of this actually winning, or was it just doing more damage at home than abroad? But as big as the consumer boycott became, it was never really the main event. The real story was energy. And this is the part that explains why Washington eventually changed direction. Here are the numbers, and they're hard to argue with. The U.S. gets roughly 99% of its imported natural gas from Canada, about 85% of its imported electricity, around 60% of its imported crude oil. These aren't minor trade relationships. They're structural dependencies wired directly into the American economy. Gulf Coast refineries were literally built to process heavy crude from Alberta's oil sands. They can't just swap suppliers without massive technical and financial pain. For decades, American refiners also quietly enjoyed a hidden discount most people never hear about. Western Canadian Select crude traditionally traded $14 to $18 a barrel below West Texas Intermediate, not because it was worse oil, but because of geography, pipeline limits, and one simple fact: Canada essentially had one major buyer. And when you only have one buyer, that buyer sets the price. For years, that arrangement worked fine for Canada because the oil kept moving south, and it handed American refiners billions in savings through that built-in discount. Then Canada started building a way out. Alberta proposed a new pipeline capable of moving 1 million barrels a day west toward Pacific markets instead of south to the Gulf. Add in the expanded Trans Mountain pipeline, capable of moving 900,000 to 1 million barrels a day, and Canada suddenly had the capacity to redirect as much as 1.9 million barrels away from American refiners entirely. That changes the whole equation. The moment the U.S. stops being Canada's only major customer, it loses its pricing power. Asian buyers paying full market price shrink the discount American refiners had banked on for decades. Shrinking discounts mean rising energy costs for American industry, and rising industrial costs eventually land on regular consumers. That's the math that started worrying people in Washington's financial and policy circles. It wasn't the wine. It wasn't the bourbon. It was the realization that Canada was patiently, deliberately building an entirely different energy future, one that didn't need American approval. And then came the moment that flipped the whole confrontation. Mark Carney accepted an invitation to speak at the Economic Club of New York. What followed was one of the more disciplined pieces of political communication in recent memory. He didn't walk in angry. He didn't list grievances or throw punches at the Trump administration. No theatrics, no accusations. Instead, he did something far more dangerous to the other side's argument. He brought numbers. With the calm, measured delivery of a former central banker, Carney laid out Canada's future in hard facts. $1 trillion in targeted investment over 5 years, an investment tax rate now the lowest in the G7, roughly half the group average, 4 points below the United States. A plan to export 50 million tons of liquefied natural gas a year by decade's end, with room to double that within 10 years after. 56 critical minerals agreements signed with more than 10 countries, unlocking over $18 billion in investment. Plans to add 160 gigawatts of electricity generation capacity. This wasn't a country pleading for better treatment. This was a country positioning itself as a global investment destination, an emerging energy power, and one of the most attractive places in the developed world to park long-term capital. Investors noticed. Canada started posting the highest foreign direct investment per capita in the entire G7. Germany's state-owned energy company had already locked in a 20-year deal to buy 1 million tons of LNG annually from the Cedar LNG project. While Washington kept talking tariffs, Berlin was quietly locking down Canadian energy for the next 2 decades. Then Carney said the sentence that changed the temperature of the room. A strong Canada will help make America great again. On the surface, it sounded almost like a courtesy, maybe even a wink at familiar American political language. It wasn't. It was a precisely built statement rooted in economic fact. What Carney was actually saying was this: Canada isn't a dependent nation asking for favors. Canada is a partner, and that partnership is stitched directly into the North American economy. It isn't optional, and tearing it apart would cost Washington far more than most people were willing to admit. Then he laid out the receipts. Canada buys more American goods than China, Japan, and Germany combined. It supplies 99% of America's imported natural gas, 85% of its imported electricity, 60% of its imported crude. The message was unmistakable. The United States depends on Canada far more than it likes to say out loud, and Canada is steadily building a future that depends less and less on American approval. That wasn't a threat. It was something far more persuasive. It was evidence. In the weeks after Carney's New York speech, the mood in Washington started shifting. Not dramatically, not with a press conference. Like most real geopolitical course corrections, it happened quietly, in the small print of language and behavior. The sharpest rhetoric faded. Talk of new tariffs slowed down. Behind closed doors, conversations that used to be about pressure and ultimatums started drifting toward negotiation and shared interest. Republican lawmakers from agricultural and energy states, watching their own local businesses absorb the fallout from the boycott and staring down the possibility of losing access to discounted Canadian energy, started quietly nudging the White House toward de-escalation. American companies with supply chains crossing the border multiple times during production made their concerns known too, through whatever channels they had. And Donald Trump, whatever else you think of him, has always watched the numbers that shape his political standing closely. He looked at them. Wine exports gutted. Bourbon at a decade low. Kentucky distilleries cutting production. Canada courting new buyers across Asia. Germany signing 20-year energy contracts with Ottawa while Washington was still stuck talking tariffs. Picture the meeting that almost certainly happened somewhere in Washington. Advisors around a table, staring at export figures and dependency models, until someone finally asks the question nobody wanted to say out loud. Can this actually keep going? The silence after that question was probably the most honest moment in the whole saga. There was no clean path to escalation. No convincing case that more tariffs would produce a win. Just the uncomfortable reality that the costs of this fight were landing harder on the U.S. than almost anyone had planned for. That was the real turning point. Quiet, unremarkable, and exactly how these shifts usually happen. Washington didn't retreat with an announcement or an apology. It did what powerful governments tend to do when reality forces their hand. It changed its tone. The conversation moved from confrontation to negotiation, from ultimatums to mutual interest, from "Canada needs us" to the harder truth. This relationship was always built on mutual dependence. When Carney was later asked about the shift, his answer stayed exactly as steady as it had been from the start. This was never one country dictating terms while the other begged for scraps. As he put it, the United States doesn't write all the rules. Now let's zoom out, because this story is bigger than wine, oil, or tariffs. It's part of a pattern that's been building for years, and it matters for the future of American influence everywhere. Here's the pattern. Pick a target, apply maximum pressure, assume they'll fold because America is bigger, then act like your leverage has no limit and no cost. But leverage has never been unlimited, and it's never been free. Every time economic pressure gets used like a blunt weapon, three things tend to happen at once. First, the target gets a very strong reason to build alternatives. Canada isn't unique here. You can watch the same pattern spreading across Europe and Asia, as countries realize that leaning on one partner too heavily is a strategic weak point. So they diversify energy sources, build new trade routes, deepen other partnerships, not because working with the US has become impossible, but because overdependence has become too risky to ignore. Second, that opens the door for other global players. China's the obvious one, but the EU, India, and a growing list of middle powers benefit too, just by looking stable and predictable. They don't need to beat America at everything. They just need to look more reliable, when reliability is what decides the deal. Third, and this is the one that matters most, repeated economic coercion slowly erodes one of America's biggest advantages: credibility. The dollar's global role, the strength of U.S. markets, the reason countries want to partner with Washington in the first place, all of it rests on trust and predictability. Every public fight with a longtime ally chips a little more off that foundation. For now, the Canada dispute ended with Washington easing off. But the bigger lesson is what comes next. The next country facing this kind of pressure will study Canada's playbook closely. They'll see that patient resistance, paired with steadily building alternatives, can reshape the whole negotiation. They'll notice that 73% of Canadians backed staying the course. They'll notice Germany locking in decades of Canadian energy. They'll take inventory of their own leverage Washington might be underestimating, and they'll plan accordingly. This wasn't an isolated event. It's an early look at how economic power works now. When broad pressure runs into a country that's patient, economically significant, and well-connected internationally, the outcome can look nothing like the old power calculations predicted. The real question is whether Washington learns the right lesson from it. Not, we should have pushed harder. Not, we should have escalated sooner. The harder lesson is this. In a deeply connected global economy, leverage runs both ways. Supply chains cut in both directions. The country you're publicly leaning on today might be tomorrow's alternative supplier, or investment partner, or ally somewhere else entirely. And when the fallout starts showing up in places like Kentucky, where distilleries slow down because Canadians are buying something else now, the strength on display in public starts looking very different from the reality behind closed doors. Which brings us back to where we started. Donald Trump stood in front of the cameras and said Canada should become the 51st state. He said America didn't need anything Canada had. But over the following months, the numbers told a completely different story. American wine exports to Canada down 78%. Hundreds of millions gone from a single market. Bourbon at its lowest point in a decade. Kentucky slowing production. Canada expanding toward Asian energy markets. Its investment tax rate now among the most competitive in the G7. Germany locking in 20-year energy contracts with Ottawa. And Mark Carney standing in front of a New York audience, asking for nothing, just showing the data. Slowly, Washington's tone shifted. Trump didn't lose this in one dramatic moment, and Canada didn't win it with a victory lap. Something quieter happened. The math of mutual dependence eventually outweighed the performance of one-sided dominance. Once the underlying economic reality became impossible to argue with, even the loudest rhetoric had to bend. Some will call that Washington backing down. There's a more accurate way to see it: a recalibration forced by reality. A strategy built on a bad assumption ran straight into the limits of genuine interdependence. The lesson here isn't that America is weak. It's that no country, not even the most powerful one on Earth, can operate forever as if its leverage has no ceiling, its dependencies are invisible, or its partners have nowhere else to go. Canada had somewhere else to go. And once that became undeniable, the entire balance of the fight changed. My name is Evelyn Carter. I study political science at the University of Toronto, and I focus on the structural shifts in global power that usually show up quietly in the data long before they make headlines. This was one of those moments. If you found this useful, start training yourself to spot these patterns, because this same dynamic is already playing out across trade relationships in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Canada wasn't the last example. It was just one of the first times the pattern became too obvious to miss. Stay curious, keep asking questions, and I'll see you in the next one.